Why is Putin so obsessed with Ukraine? Vladimir Putin is a man that's no stranger to controversy in the world of geopolitics. And, for the past decade at least, it seems Putin has always had one big target: Ukraine. Once a part of the same nation, later close allies, and eventually bitter enemies, Russia and Ukraine have a history together that goes back a millennia. But how did relations between Russia and Ukraine reach this point? And why is Putin so obsessed with Ukraine? Let's take a closer look. To better understand how important this region of the world is, we have to go back to the 9th century, back when several Slavic tribes joined hands and formed the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus would occupy large areas of what we now know as Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And all three of these nations claimed the Kievan Rus as their cultural ancestor. For the next few centuries, the Rus would see very turbulent times, with the capital eventually being exchanged from the city of Kiev to Muscovy, now known as Moscow, in the late 13th century. There had always been a rivalry between Kiev and Moscow. At times, both cities were part of the same nation, while at other times, they were separating. Multiple years of separation led to some cultural separation as well, and eventually, there were two distinct ethnic groups formed. The Russians mainly centered around Moscow, while the Ukrainians mainly centered around Ukraine. For most of history, Russian nationalists have tried to argue that both Ukrainians and Russians are the same peoples, descendants from the Kievan Rus, while Ukrainian nationalists have always wanted an identity that is separate from Russia and in many ways completely independent from Russia. Understanding this history is important in understanding why Vladimir Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine in 2022. Fast forward to the 20th century with Ukraine and Russia being part of the same country, the USSR, but as two distinct republics and nations. In 1991, both the Ukrainian and Soviet Socialist Republic and the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic declared independence from the Soviet Union, and for the first time in multiple centuries, Russia and Ukraine were completely separate sovereign states. Relations between Ukraine and Russia were initially quite warm. In fact, Ukraine, which inherited over 3,000 nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, decided to completely give them up to Russia, with the assurance that Russia respects Ukraine's sovereignty. Despite being independent, Ukraine was highly dependent on Russia, and the first few governments were very close to Russia, almost to the point where the international community would joke about Ukraine being a puppet state, or a client state. If Ukraine and Russia would ever have any sort of dispute, Russia would always come out on top, simply because of how influential it was in Ukraine's government. 2000, Vladimir Putin, a 5'6" mammoth of a man, became the president of Russia. Putin wanted to turn Russia around from the turbulence it faced in the 90s. He initially focused on targeting separatists in Chechnya, improving economic growth, but most importantly, regaining some of the glory that Russia lost on the international stage with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Most former Soviet states were either extremely anti-Russia, like the Baltic states, or extremely pro-Russia, like Belarus and Kazakhstan. Ukraine was sort of somewhere in the middle, with a largely anti-Russian and pro-Western population, but a large Russian minority. Russia and Ukraine's relations also saw a lot of turbulence in the 2000s, but Putin, being a former KGB spy, started exerting more and more pressure on Ukraine to solve gas disputes and other disputes the two nations had. Putin had been called a lot of things: a communist, a capitalist, a dictator, an oligarch, but there is one accurate way to describe Putin. It's as a Russian nationalist. Putin wants Russia to be a superpower again, whether it's economically, militarily, or culturally, and he also believes that Ukraine, being descendant from the Kievan Rus, is also Russia. In his mind, Russia is incomplete without, what he described in his own words, the mother of all Russian cities, Kiev. In 2010, Putin saw a major victory in Russia when Viktor Yanukovych was elected as the president of Ukraine after a narrow election victory. Viktor Yanukovych, simply put, was a Russian puppet. His presidential campaign received as much as $200 million from anonymous Russian donors, which may have played a role in his victory. Almost immediately after being elected, Yanukovych fulfilled any order given to him by Russia, and almost all of the disputes between the two nations were being solved. At the same time, the Ukrainian people started to worry that Ukraine was becoming a client state of Russia. All of this reached a boiling point in 2013 when Yanukovych, at a time when the Ukrainian people wanted better integration with the EU, rejected an offer for Ukraine to sign a free trade deal with the EU in hopes to better ties with Russia. It's widely believed that Putin played a personal role in this to make sure that Ukraine remains tightly in Russia's grip. By the end of the year, Ukraine erupted with protests all over the country. As these protests grew larger and more violent, they formed into an entire revolution against the Yanukovych administration and Russian influence in Ukraine. The revolution was extremely violent, with hundreds of demonstrators being killed by Ukraine's government with full Russian support. But eventually, it got too large for the government to handle. Yanukovych eventually fled to Russia on February 21, 2014, with Ukraine's parliament holding an impeachment vote the next day. 328 out of 447 members of the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych as president, and in his place, an anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalist named Petro Poroshenko was elected, turning Ukraine and Russia into sworn enemies. For the following years, Putin would make repeated attempts at pressurizing Ukraine. He ordered the annexation of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea in 2014, which was successful after he armed numerous Russian rebel groups on the eastern side of the country. With Ukraine becoming more and more pro-Western, Putin seems to have had no choice but to either abandon his Russian nationalism and irredentism or start a full-scale war against Ukraine. That brings us to where we are today. Russia has gathered over 200,000 troops, militants, and Russian separatists along Ukraine's borders,